book of Isaiah. Please turn to me to Isaiah 41. Isaiah 41. We're not doing the entire book, but snapshots out of it, working our way through. And remember, too, that the Old Testament prophets were not necessarily sequential and chronological in their viewpoint. So Isaiah is ministering around 780 or so, or 720 BC, 740 BC, until somewhere in the late 600s BC. So about 700 years before the time of Christ. And he is looking ahead to the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586. That hasn't happened yet. But about 120 years after his time is when that will occur. And he does have a good deal of prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem, about what's going to happen, about the coming of the Babylonians. And then he does look beyond that to some other things, including the coming of a Persian emperor named Cyrus. And that'll show up a little bit in our study tonight, and it'll show up again in a few more chapters. Cyrus, king of Persia, is the one who's going to conquer Babylon, take that over, and that will have an impact on the Jews and Judea. And then Isaiah looks beyond that time period of about 500 or so BC, all the way into a time period which he describes in several places in his prophecies as the lion will lie down with the lamb, and a little child will play with a cobra, and the desert is going to bloom and bring forth all kinds of beauty and bounty, and there's not going to be any warfare. The nations of the earth will convert their weapons of war into agricultural implements, and there's going to be peace. What time period would that be? That's the millennium. He's talking about the millennium, 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ, and that's future to us. So Isaiah 700 BC was looking ahead to the fall of Jerusalem, 586, the coming of Cyrus, Persian Empire. He's looking ahead to the Messiah. He's got stuff in his book about the Messiah. And then he looks all the way into the future, and he sees the millennial kingdom, which is still future to us. Now, what he doesn't see, what he couldn't see, was the church age. We don't find any information about the church age, and we're told in the New Testament that's because the church age is a mystery to the Old Testament people. They couldn't see it. The concept of the church, if you had told Isaiah, guess what? There's going to be this organism, this special thing called the body of Christ, the body of the Messiah, in which Jews and Gentiles will be together as equals. And they're going to worship God, and they're going to study the Bible, and they're going to share the gospel with nations all over the world. Isaiah would have said, "You're crazy." He couldn't see it. To him, God's people was the Jews, period. And the pagans, the Gentiles, are the enemies, and they were. So Isaiah, along with other Old Testament prophets, they simply could not see the church age because it was hidden from them. They didn't know a thing about it. Well, tonight we're looking at chapter 41, and it's kind of like a series of conversations, mostly from the Lord. And what he's doing is he's talking to different people. And the first person he's going to talk to is Cyrus, this emperor of Persia that I mentioned a moment ago. And all the conversations are leading towards a central question, which was very, very significant to the Jews of Isaiah's day. And it is this: is God able and trustworthy to keep the covenant promises that he made to Israel? Will he keep his word? That's the central question that is being asked in this chapter. And so in verses 1 through 4, God is going to talk about Cyrus. Verses 5 through 7, the response of the pagan world to the coming of Cyrus. Verses 8 through 10, God talks to Israel and gives them a promise. Then there's kind of a scene shift at the end of verse 10, and we're moving into the millennial kingdom. And verses 11 through 13, the millennium, 14 through 16, possibly Armageddon, 17 through 20, the blessing of the Lord on the land in the millennium. And then from 21 really to the end of the chapter is a challenge from God to those who would seek assurance in idolatry, in other gods. So let's take a look at it. Isaiah 41, and let me read a couple of verses starting at verse 1. Coastlands, listen to me in silence, and let the peoples gain new strength. Let them come forward, then let them speak. Let us come together for judgment. Who has aroused one from the east, whom he calls in righteousness to his feet? He delivers up nations before him and subdues kings. He makes them like dust with his sword, as the wind-driven chaff with his bow. He pursues them, passing on in safety, by a way he had not been traversing with his feet. Who has performed and accomplished it, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, am the first, and with the last I am he. And so Isaiah has God speaking, and he says, who is it that calls somebody from that phrasing there in verse 2, who has aroused one from the east? The one from the east is Cyrus, and he's actually going to be mentioned by name in a few more chapters. And Cyrus is going to come from the east, from the land of Media, Persia, what today would be Iran, and he is going to conquer Babylon, and then he's going to conquer much of the known world. And this one is coming, and he's been appointed by God. God says, I am the one who's doing this. We actually can gain great confidence and encouragement from that concept that God appointed Cyrus a job to do. Cyrus was not a godly man. He was not a Christian. He was not a believer. He was not a Jew. But he has been appointed by God to do certain things. Among them, Cyrus is going to be the one who will issue a decree. I'm saying to the Jewish people, go back home. Go back to Jerusalem. Rebuild your temple. Worship Yahweh as you see fit. And he actually funded it. He actually gave money towards it. So why can we gain great encouragement and confidence from this concept that God appointed Cyrus a job to do, including conquering the world? He has the right to use anybody he wants to do anything that accomplishes his will, including pagans. And he can and he does do that. And what that means is God is still in charge. God is in charge today. When things seem pretty unsettled and we're not sure which direction the government is pointed at any given minute, God is still in charge. And so we can take great comfort from that. Now in verse 5, 6, and 7, look at this. The coastlands have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. They have drawn near and have come. Each one helps his neighbor and says to his brother, be strong. And so the coastlands, that's all the nations, all the pagan nations, they're scared of Cyrus because he's gobbling everything up. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be alive in, say, 1935? And every day you get the newspaper and you read about what is happening in Europe, and Mussolini, and Hitler, and the Axis powers, and so on. And every single day you look at the newspaper and say, oh, look at that. They just took over Czechoslovakia. Look at that. They just annexed the Sudetenland. And on and on. Every well, the coastlands are scared of Cyrus. And they are turning to idols. Look in verse 7. So the craftsman encourages the smelter, and he who smooths metal with a hammer encourages him who beats the anvil, saying of the soldering, it is good. and he fastens it with nails so that it will not totter. How do the pagan nations respond to the specter of a great world power arising on the eastern horizon, the Persian Empire, guided by this mastermind, this master strategist, Cyrus the Great? How do the pagans respond to that? They say, we got to get a better God. let's build us a better God. We'll get, this time we'll do it with gold, you know, and it's going to be a better God. And so they smooth it and they texture it, and the guy who's going to buy the idol says to the craftsman, you did a good job soldering that joint. That looks really good. I'm proud of this God. You can see there's a little bit of humor even in the back of this, and I was just going to come back to this concept. But they're turning to idols. They're turning to things that are made by hand. Now, we tend to laugh at that. We think of that as a very primitive, pagan, backward kind of a thing to do, to actually believe that a block of wood or a stone or something is going to help you. But you and I both know that there is a built-in tendency in the human heart to make our own idols. And it probably is not a block of wood or a chunk of stone. What are the idols that we in the 21st century are likely to depend on? Money, power, connections, things that we say, well, I may not have enough money, but I got powerful friends. I counseled a man many years ago who talked constantly about his friends in South Boston. And if I need them, they'll be here, he says, over and over again. All these things that we think are going to help us, and we construct these idols in our minds and our hearts, but God is not impressed with us at all. Look in verse 8. God is now going to talk to Israel directly. So this is what he says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend." There's a handful, 2 or 3 places in the entire Bible where God says about Abraham, my friend. Very, very powerful terminology. And he's saying, Abraham is my friend, and you're his descendants. Very, very special. You whom I have taken from the ends of the earth and called from its remotest parts, and I said to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not rejected you. Verse 10. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. This is in some ways kind of the core of the whole chapter. God is saying to the Jewish people, don't be like those pagans that make their idols. Don't be afraid. Yes, hard times are coming. It's going to be challenging. 100 years from now, Jerusalem will be destroyed. And after that, there's Cyrus. There's hard things coming down the road. But I'm with you. I'm here. I'm upholding you with my right hand. And so God is saying, I am not going to abandon you. I'm not going to let go of you. You belong to me, and you always will. So God is reinforcing his covenant promises that he will never let go of Israel. Israel will always be God's chosen people, and he's reinforcing that promise. Now there's a scene shift, and starting in verse 11, this would seem to be looking ahead into the millennial kingdom. So listen to these words. Behold, all those who are angered at you will be shamed and dishonored. Those who contend with you will be as nothing and will perish. You will seek those who quarrel with you, but will not find them. Those who war with you will be as nothing and non-existent. So from the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC until the present day, there have been periods of time when Israel had at least the trappings or the appearances of a nation or a state, including from 1947 until now. However, the conditions that are described in these verses do not seem to have obtained in 2,500 years. For Israel to look around and say, there were people who were trying to kill me, and now I can't find them. Where'd they go? Well, how about north, south, east, and west? All around Israel, almost all the time. Again, there have been periods of time when the Jews were sort of assimilated into other cultures and other countries. There are times when they had a little bit of peace, but if you go back and read through history, you'll discover that the Jews have never had security and peace as is being described here. That's why we think this is talking about the millennial kingdom. We think this is talking about a future time when Israel will be secure and their enemies will be gone because God will have judged them. In verse 14, this is maybe the millennium or the language. Well, you think about it, see if you can come up with a better idea. Verses 14 through 16. Do not fear, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel. I will help you, declares the Lord, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Behold, I have made you a new sharp threshing sledge with double edges. You will thresh the mountains and pulverize them, and will make the hills like chaff. You will winnow them, and the wind will carry them away, and the storm will scatter them. But you will rejoice in the Lord. You will glory in the Holy One of Israel. So there's a sense in 14 through 16 that Israel's going to win. Israel's going to have conquest, and the enemies, those who would be against them, are going to be destroyed, not just destroyed, but pulverized. So a threshing, you know what a threshing sledge is. So it's almost like a toboggan or a sled, and it's got sharp runners, possibly with metal on the bottom, and you have an animal like a donkey or an ox or something running around on top of harvested grain to break it up. And after it's been threshed like that, you would come along with a winnowing fork, something like a pitchfork, and on a semi-windy day, you don't want it too windy, you want it a little bit breezy though, usually on a flat hilltop, you would get this winnowing fork, and you would toss forkfuls of it in the air, and the breeze is going to carry away the chaff. What's the chaff? The straw, all the straw, and the kernels, the grains, the usable wheat or rye or barley or whatever, is going to fall back down because it's heavier. And that's what you're going to collect. That's what you're going to grind with a millstone or a mortar and pestle, and that's going to be your flour for bread. But the picture here is of pulverizing things. My suggestion is that this is possibly Armageddon. Possibly Armageddon, the pulverizing of Israel's enemies. The land will be blessed, 17 through 20. And he's going to open, afflicted and needy is seeking water, there's none, their tongue is parched. I, the Lord, will answer them myself. Verse 18, I'll open rivers on the bare heights, springs in the midst of the valleys. I'll make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land fountains of water. Cedar in the wilderness, verse 19, acacia and myrtle, olive tree. So there's trees, there's abundance. The arid places are going to be well watered, and God is going to do this in verse 20. Now, a little bit farther on, really to the end of the chapter, it's more about God being in charge of the events of the day and the future. Look at verse 29, last verse. Behold, all of them are false. Their works are worthless. Their molten images are wind and emptiness. So it's really, the last part of it is a challenge from God to Israel to not turn to the idolatry or the worldview of the pagans. Don't be like them. Don't turn to what they think about. Don't try to put your trust in what they trust in. Don't count on what the pagan nations are doing to be solid and stabilizing, because it's not. Instead, put your trust in me. So, a challenge against idolatry and a challenge to trust the Lord in very, very challenging, difficult days. Other comments or questions? Yes.
Verse 25, I have a loud one from the Lord, and this time is rising the sun. You call my name, and you rulers of the world, even the pillars steps and clay. Is this talking about the east side of the?
No, this is from the north. Probably Jesus. Probably a messianic reference. Treading on the clay like a potter. And we're getting close to a new, very, very important section, chapter 42. We're going to be introduced to somebody who's called the servant. And the identity and the nature and the work of the servant, starting in chapter 42, runs to the end of the book, but it reaches a crescendo in chapter 53. So the servant is somebody very, very special, and as we work through who is the servant, we find out eventually it's the Messiah. The servant is the Messiah. And Isaiah is talking about him 700 years before Jesus was born. And that's one of his titles, is the servant of the Lord. Yeah. Yes. Other questions, comments? Take your prayer bulletin.